Hi, everyone. Welcome back to TRD Talks Live. My name is Erin Hudson, and tonight we'll be discussing how to design around infectious diseases. Joining us is developer Dan Hollander at DHA Capital, our architect Eran Chen of ODA, and Joanna Frank, who leads the Center for Active Design, which is a nonprofit that runs programs focused on how building design can improve health. The center operates the health certification program, Fitwell, and also consults with major real estate companies around the world, including the city of New York. So before we get started on our conversation, just a quick reminder to all our viewers, we bring these conversations to you for free 3 times a week. And if you find value in the work that we do at The Real Deal, the best way to show your support is to become a subscriber. So now let's kick off our conversation. So I want to actually start with you, Joanna, since you are advising major real estate owners and operators, and you also have a direct line to the CDC. Tell us a little bit, as reopening is on the horizon, what are the questions that you're fielding, and what are you advising people to do in preparation for people coming back to work?
Sure, thank you. So I would say that what we've been advising has really changed over the last 12 weeks because our understanding of COVID-19 has changed and continues to change, actually. So what we were hearing from our users, so Fitwell has many users, including a lot of the big New York real estate companies, Vornado, Tishman Speyer, Alexandria, and so on. And right at the beginning, people were like, we need to put together a plan about how do we mitigate viral transmission. What do we know about viral transmission? And then what do we know that is specific about COVID-19? So what we did is we went and looked at the research. We did a literature review of previous pandemics, previous epidemics of other viruses, so SARS and MERS, even flu pandemics and so on, to understand like how do you mitigate the transmission of viruses generally? And the answer to that is obviously social distancing. I think everyone's heard a lot about this person-to-person transmission, but also this person-to-surface transmission, as well as the potential for aerosolized transmission. So that's when it gets, when the smaller droplets go into HVAC systems. So we've put out recommendations on how to deal with that mitigation. But then very quickly, the real estate community were telling us, like, all of these tech companies and folks are telling us, like, use our equipment, use our particular gadget, and it's going to help to make you COVID free. And by the way, no one can be COVID free, so you can only mitigate risk. No COVID free zones, unfortunately. So then we started to advise on fever screening technologies and UV technologies and all sorts of different technologies. People wanted to know what the evidence base was behind how effective they are. And then as folks have come, you want to know?
I just wanted to, on the fever screening, you've had some surprising results. For instance, you were saying that fever screening is not necessarily something that attacks viral transmission. So could you talk a little bit? I think you've had some surprising results at times.
Sure, absolutely. So what I would say is that fever screening as a technology is a valid technology. So fever screening can detect if you have a temperature. It typically actually looks at the surface of your skin temperatures. It's not looking at your core temperature. But it is effective. It's an effective technology. And it was used effectively against the SARS pandemic. But this is where COVID-19 is different from other viruses, in that with SARS, people presented with a temperature very quickly. They had symptoms right at the beginning of having the virus, and therefore it was relatively effective. With COVID-19, as we all know, it can be asymptomatic in more than 30% of cases, and also many people who go on to develop symptoms are asymptomatic for many days, 5 to 6 days, I think is where the thinking is at this point. And then even if you develop symptoms, you may not develop a temperature. So the efficacy rate of fever screening for COVID-19 is thought to be less than 50%. So you are really not, it is not a panacea. Where we have seen it to be effective is actually on the mental health piece, on the building trust piece, that having fever screening evident in your retail mall or in your multi-tenant building can actually show like we are doing everything to mitigate the transmission of this disease. But it should never be presented as a panacea, because it isn't in the case of COVID-19.
Right. Well, so I wanted to find out a little bit from Dan and Eran. What are you hearing? Maybe Eran, we can start with you. You've got a lot of projects in the works in various stages of design and development. Since this crisis has begun, are you going back and changing any elements of the design due to COVID?
Well, the answer is a little bit, maybe not as much as I would like to. We are, the world of the private sector, I'm sure Dan can speak to that as well, is always looking for sort of the next thing. What would be the next thing to do, to deal with with market situation, to deal with real estate in general. And there's a lot of that kind of conversation that's going on with our clients to make sure that we're responsive enough. And I can name a few of those elements that has been raised. For example, we've been, advocating for outdoor spaces in apartments forever since we started doing projects in New York City. And actually, Dan and I have designed together a building in Williamsburg back when was it? A few years ago, where every apartment, even the smallest one, had sort of a courtyard associated with it. And my motivation was not COVID. My motivation was mental health in increasing densified cities in general. And it's funny not funny, but it's interesting to see how that became a huge thing for developers right now, responding to the idea of people stuck at home. And so there's situations, for example, where I just went through a month of convincing one of my clients for a vertical tower in Midtown to do it in a certain way that would maximize the amount of outdoor space. And he was very skeptic about this whole thing. And now this is, his mantra. We got to make as many of those as possible. There's other elements. For example, what are the technological aspects that we can incorporate in buildings to at least, as Joanna says, release some tension from people, give them a comfort level that things are being considered. For example, applications by which you don't touch your doors. That's an easy thing to do. People can enter their lobbies, enter the elevator, and enter their apartment with basically not touching anything. There are even discussions with one of my clients about purification room at the lobby, in a sense that people would come in and then get purified before they go up. There are discussions about the materiality with the rumors of certain materials that don't hold the virus longer than others, and should we change that? All of these are good thinking. I think they're short-term thinking, but there's a lot of long-term thinking that I think we need to do.
Well, let's come back to that in a second. Dan, I'm curious for you as a residential developer, do you think that there's going to be less of an emphasis on amenities going forward? A lot of gyms, that these were big things people wanted in their buildings, but they have been closed down. So I guess I'm curious if you think that there's going to be any big shifts going forward.
I mean, I doubt it. Would you rather use a public gym or one that's in your building? As long as you can verify that it's being cleaned appropriately. It may require more resources, better cleaning. I think a building's gym probably isn't cleaned down that often. But no, I don't think that we're thinking about eliminating public spaces from the buildings. I think that it's more, as Eran was saying, about trying to do what you can to make that building a little less of a, transmission vehicle for the virus. It is kind of limited what you can do. I think the biggest thing is probably air circulation. It's more relevant in an office building than residential. I'm actually designing an office building right now, a boutique building in Soho, and we are going back and trying to look at systems, introduce disinfecting filtration systems, which you can electrify essentially your air handling unit, which ionizes things and creates bigger particles and then zaps them, so it will kill a lot of the virus. Hospitals use UV light, and maybe we'll see more of that in air filtration systems. But in that project, we were already introducing something like 35% more fresh air than would be typical in an office building. And I chose to do that because I just think those buildings are better to work in. You know, it's a better experience for the tenants. And that happens to be, you know, helpful on, keeping virus levels down, is introducing more fresh air. You know, on the residential side, again, introducing fresh air into the apartment is nice. It's very expensive. It's hard to, and it chews up a lot of valuable real estate. So we tend not to do it to a great extent, but that Battery Park City buildings do it because they mandated it. But it's something that I think we should strive to do. And then all the touchless entry systems, although I have yet to see the elevators truly integrated. If Eran knows about it, I need to know about it, because what I'm hearing is they've all got plans, but they're not quite there yet.
Eran, do you want to weigh in on the elevator situation?
I mean, we can have a side conversation. I don't know if we want to share all of the secrets then with the rest of the world, but there is a technology that can be applied to the control of the elevator, so to prevent the pressing of a button. And there are increasingly amount of applications that are being developed as we speak for all of these things, like locks that are open to a recognition. But the whole idea of face recognition, for example, if you want to kind of talk about the broader applications in places like airports, etc., I think this is going to go into a very high gear, where technologies are going to try to expedite our processes as we go through places, using artificial intelligence and face recognitions and other technologies that would minimize the amount of, sort of personal physical interactions, but also expedite processes in large.
Well, Joanna, when we're talking about fresh air, just to go back to that, do you imagine that there might be space for some sort of regulations around air filtration systems? And, you know, they are expensive. What is your sense about maybe the direction that could be going in?
Gosh, there's a lot to unpack there with air. So I would say that of the different transmissions of COVID-19, so person to person, person to surface, and aerosolized is the one we know least about. The WHO at the moment is recommending that we design to mitigate viral transmission for COVID-19, but there still isn't enough of a body of evidence that we know that it is still infectious when it has been aerosolized. So we know it is aerosolized, but we don't know if it's at a great enough concentration to actually be harmful. So there's so much we don't know about the aerosolized transmission right now. So let's just put that out there. Not that these aren't best practices, because they are. Filtration, humidity, increased air absolutely impacts the transmission of airborne viruses. So they're two different thoughts. I would say when it comes to energy, when it comes to HVAC systems, and this is what Dan has already just mentioned, by increasing filtration systems, by increasing the amount of outside air you're bringing into a system, you're actually increasing the energy use of that system, which is more expensive, but is also bad for the air quality and for the environment. And so there definitely has to be a balance of understanding what threat are we facing from this aerosolized transmission compared to balancing that with a known increase in energy use, which will absolutely have consequences to energy use and outdoor air. And outdoor air is also associated with an increased risk of viral transmission and actually becoming sicker from any kind of respiratory disease. So I think it's never that simple, right? It has to be a balance. And I think that ASHRAE has done a good job putting out recommendations specifically for viral transmission. I think now we're all going to have to kind of balance the energy with the viral transmission piece, and be sophisticated in not just jumping onto this issue and then forgetting all of the advances we've made in energy conservation. Understanding. And then there's a whole equity issue, right? We're probably talking about high-end residential right now. I mean, we work a lot with affordable, it's something that we need to understand for all classes of our real estate.
I guess I'm curious how, for new development, that's one conversation, absolutely. But in terms of retrofitting, Eran, maybe can you speak at all to, just what would those projects look like, and how much room might you actually have to maneuver if you're going to do some sort of a renovation? And Dan, also feel free to jump in.
Well, first, I must say that I totally agree with Joanna that we've been, in the past decade, we've been increasingly reliant on mechanical systems to treat our air in our buildings. And then we started to realize that having more mechanical systems in building in general is more expensive. It takes much more real estate and space, and it burns more energy, which now seems to us as big of a risk or of anything else. And I've been always a big supporter of fresh ventilations and going a little bit to more primitive systems by which air runs through the building through great design. You don't get fresher air than opening a window. So there's a balancing between smart building and technologies that has been developed and zero buildings, and then how much we overpower technology. When it comes to retrofits, it becomes even more complex because we're dealing with old structures that are not as sealed, perhaps, as the new construction has been. And today, with curtain wall systems as such, you can get a building that is almost 90-95% sealed from fresh air to come in. You can't achieve that with retrofit wall buildings. And therefore, I think the questions become less of mechanically or technology related and more just common sense and great design.
Dan, what do you think about that? I mean, do you think that the opportunities, is there more opportunity in new development, or would you say that you can still see opportunity to do the same things if it's in a retrofit?
Well, no, Eran's right. I mean, you clearly cannot do the same things in a retrofit. You have to deal with the hand that you're dealt, and an older building is, simply not going to be as well sealed, and you probably can't introduce major new mechanical systems without spending a fortune. So, for economic purposes, it really can't be done. Honestly, in the residential retrofits that I'm looking at right now, my bigger question is about work from home. So I'm thinking about the dwelling as, maybe somebody will be working from there, and maybe someone's actually willing to, to buy an extra little bit of, or rent an extra little bit of square footage as a little home office, whereas previously they wouldn't have thought to do that. Because I do think that that's going to become more a part of the landscape. When you look at surveys of, office workers, you see a good 25 to 30% who will say today that they wish they could work more of their work week from home. So the good news from an office, landlord's perspective is that, 75% of people still want to go to the office to a great extent, but then there's, another chunk of people who would rather not. So I'm sort of thinking about that. And also if you're not going to the office, I think Zuckerberg said the other day, it opens up a talent pool that they don't have access to. Now, what he's not saying is, we can pay them less because you don't have to live in New York City. But, but I think that's, as a residential developer, I start thinking about locations that, might not be so central, that might actually be desirable as long as they're, in walkable urban neighborhoods, which I think, people are demanding more and more these days. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that are shifting because of this, and not necessarily just the physical space, but sort of where it is too.
Right. Yeah. All the tech companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, have all said that they're going to be working remotely for sure. And in Twitter's case, possibly permanently for people who wish to. So, I think there's sort of two camps of people who think that this work from home future is a little bit overblown. And others who really think that that is the future. And I'm curious, Joanna, what do you think based on the conversations that you've been having? And you have some international clients as well. So
we do. We work globally. So we've also kind of seen this unfolding, starting, in China. We have quite a few clients in Taiwan who have done an amazing job, of course, of mitigating this. I think what we see from the evidence base and what we know from the last decade, actually the reason we started active design under the Bloomberg administration was to entice businesses to come to New York City. So there was this real understanding that the city as a place, and New York City specifically, needed to compete for talent, it needed to compete for business. And the way we did that was looking at the quality of life and creating places that entice people, that people want to spend their lives in, that they want to live in the neighborhoods, they want to hang out at that cafe, they want to walk down that street. And we use design to create those enticing places. And the evidence base is massive about the connection between design and creating places that are optimized for people. I mean, we have 5,600 peer-reviewed research studies behind Fitwell, looking at all aspects of this. So I think that we as people, as creatures, as humans, we do respond to design. We do want to be social. We do want to put ourselves in places that energize us, that entice us. We want to see nature. We want to see each other. We enjoy living in walkable neighborhoods. Dan's right that the majority of millennials and half of baby boomers actually say they would prefer to live in walkable neighborhoods, and yet only 2% of real estate listings across the US would be considered highly walkable. So there was a real demand gap here that the market wasn't fulfilling. So I don't think cities are dead. I don't think urban environments are dead. And I think we already know how to optimize them for people. I'm just hoping that this will actually be a moment to really make significant strides about optimizing them for people, because Barcelona's doing it and Paris is doing it. So guess what, New York City, if we don't do it, if we don't jump, into the mix here and lead like we always have done around how to create the city for the people that it serves, then we may very well lose people to other places. So I think it's a great opportunity. We know how to do it. We've done it before. We've done it many times before. So I feel optimistic, actually, that New York can entice people to stay and to continue to move here using its design and using its streets and its energy and the vibrance, because this is what people want. They need it for their mental health. We need it for our physical activity levels. You won't walk somewhere if there's nowhere to go and if it's not interesting along the way. You just won't. We know that from research.
Eran, I see you nodding. Do you want to, you kind of mentioned long-term impacts. Where do you think the future could go as a result of this?
Yeah, I think that Joanna started sort of touching what I think would be the biggest, I don't want to say change because things has been changing, but maybe expedited dramatically because of COVID-19. The idea of localization, the fact that we want to be able to think at least that we can be local and still feel a full life without being dependent on transit, without being dependent on, moving everywhere to do things, but being able to live, work, and play in an area that is inclusive, that is accessible. We talk about walkable, I think also bikeable. This is the big thing. With less dependency on transit, and which is more local. Now, what is that going to do? I agree with that. I don't think there's going to be a major reduction in working from office. I think people now realizes that it's possible and it's maybe even pleasant to spend a day of a week working from home. I'm not convinced that employers actually would find it beneficial, because at the grand scheme of things, when things are good, I think the savings on sort of less office space or less expenses might be minor, more than or less than people would imagine. But I do think that both code-wise, zoning-wise, planning-wise, and urban-wise, we need to have less cars, more walkable, more bike lanes, and more mixed-use neighborhoods. And this is, to me, the biggest thing that we need to continue and advocate with city planning and others, where we need to find smart formulas, because what drives developments today, we all know, is residential. Residential is where the value is. Developers are not really overly excited by doing manufacturing or office spaces in remote places other than in Manhattan. And I think the city needs to be creative and incentivize developers to build more mixed-use projects that are real mixed-use, where people can actually stay, live, work, walk, the commercial, retail, culture in other places than, the center of Manhattan. And the way that I would like to envision the city in maybe 20 years is where the 5 boroughs have many different centers, and people can live and enjoy their own local center while enjoying other centers as well, without this desperate reliance on transit, without desperate reliance on subways, etc.
Well, a last question I kind of wanted to throw to all of you is one about, we're hearing a lot about the new offices of the future where there's less people in the offices and people are 6 feet apart. But what about for some restaurant spaces, retail concepts, even events like a Broadway theater? Are there ways that these types of group activities design will be able to help these groups get together, but it may have to look different than we're used to? I'm curious what you think about that. And Joanna, would you like to start us off on that?
Sure. It's a tough one. Right now we're still in that acute phase, right? We're still in the social distancing. If you can't be physically separate from people, you need to use, PPE protection, which has now become like everyone knows what that is. So I don't think at this point we're at the point where we can pack a Broadway theater again. And then I don't know whether it's viable to run theaters at a third the capacity. So I don't know how that's going to work. Outside seems like a really good idea because obviously the chance of transmission is much lower outside for various reasons. But I do think that it's going to be challenging in those kind of group settings. I was actually on a call with one of the big cinema chains, one of the big movie chains, and they were asking like what they could do, to bring people back. And everything I suggested, they're like, that's not economically viable. So it's like,
what were your suggestions?
But I think, Joanna, I think this is all temporary. Yes, we need to solve issues of restaurants and theaters in the next few months, or maybe, I don't know, until a vaccine is developed, until this thing is behind us. But I don't really believe that that's really going to change the way we behave and the way we socialize in the far future. Do we really think that restaurants now in 2 years, 3 years from now are going to have dividers and be 6 feet apart? Or we're not going to go to bars anymore and reach out to the barman between the crowd, or not to go to concert? There's no way. I have zero belief that that's going to impact our behavior. I think it's going to take time, clearly, and there's the financial aspects of what we're doing until it happens, but soon enough it's going to come back. And the question is, how do we take the situation right now and really move the bigger agendas forward and make better city to ourselves using this pandemic and the studies that Joanna has been doing and talking about it for a better city and a better future, without this fear that we're never going to get a hug from a friend in the future, and that we're going to live in isolation and with panels between ourselves in our office and restaurants. I just don't see any of this happening.
Yeah, so just to kind of what New York did, 100 years ago, is it created a parks department. It created Central Park in response to infectious disease. It created reservoirs upstate and piped water all the way down to New York City. Like, these are pretty radical ideas that happened in response to infectious disease previously. Let's shoot that kind of, shoot for the moon. And sorry, Dan, go ahead.
Do you think New York City is in a place, though, now to be able to actually enact any dramatic proposals like that? We're hearing a lot of concern from lawmakers about the finances of the state and the city. So, do you think that capacity is there?
I think it has to be. I think there's a price to doing nothing. We want to go talk to all of the real estate owners in Manhattan and think whether they want to leave the status quo. We have public space. They're called roads. And at the moment, we're underusing them. Why not repurpose them for different purposes? I mean, if you look at the Barcelona plan, they take a nine block grid and they reapportion the roadways to create more public space while still moving traffic through and around the blocks. Like, that is not a particularly expensive thing to do. When we created plazas out of like bits of roads that weren't being used in New York City, that was done with paint and planters. Like, this was not an expensive solution to reapportioning public space for people and creating these places that were sorely needed. So I don't think that it has to be out of the budget of New York City, especially if you look at the entirety of the cost of doing nothing, because there is a cost of doing nothing.
Dan, what do you think? I mean, maybe more from the private side, you know, are these investments that you'd be willing to make, or how could you see yourself incorporating some ideas?
You know, I think the problem that we face right now in terms of investment in New York is the political climate is really not hospitable to development. You know, on the one hand, you're facing enormous new regulation. You know, the re-upping of the rent control laws is part of it. And now there's a bill in the Senate called Good Cause Eviction that is essentially a backdoor to rent control for every dwelling unit in New York State. Not a lot has been said about it since COVID, but, you know, this could have a very chilling effect on, you know, our ability to build new housing, which the city sorely needs. So I think, and then, you know, to Eran's point about building innovative mixed use projects, there's really no subsidy for that right now for development. You know, along the lines of we get a tax abatement for building mixed income housing, but there's no subsidies that are available, no breaks in real estate taxes for building an innovative, you know, project that furthers other goals, you know, whether they be energy efficiency or being well sited. To think about the LEED criteria, there's a whole slew of criteria. And every time we build something new, the real estate taxes on that site go up dramatically, right? I mean, they increase by a factor of 5. So it's a net win for the city. If they want to encourage more development, you know, they could let the taxes go up by a factor of 2 and phase it in over time to something higher. And I think that would be a win for everybody. But, you know, right now we're looking at a lot of regulation, a lot of energy mandates. You know, the buildings have to be very, very energy efficient now with Local Law 97 and others. And we don't really have an incentive mechanism. So, you know, so we have all of that, plus the market forces, which in many ways are working against us right now. And it becomes very, very challenging. So I think the city needs to think hard about, and it's going to be very hard when there's a $14 billion hole in the budget over the next 2 years. But I think the city really has to think longer term about what it wants to do and how it wants to encourage development, and, you know, not make development the bad guy all the time. You know, it's getting set up that developers are always the bad guys, and development is always the enemy because it's only for the wealthy. But you know, those are the brutal economic realities. So we need, you know, leadership at the city and state level if we're going to break out of that trap.
And can I just respond to this? Because I agree with both Joanna and Dan. European cities are more inclined to, through their more social environment, more inclined to spend government money on public spaces, and there's plenty of examples, and we should look at those examples and adopt some of them, there's no doubt. I think that New York City also has been an innovative city to create incentive systems that is smart with the private sectors that get them something for doing something good. And I think that's what Dan is talking, and we've seen less and less of that happening. The city have created quality housing program, for example, that gives incentivized developers by floor area deductions if they have elements like natural lights and common areas, etc. The city has created the plaza bonus many years ago, where You can create private public space on your own property for height and FER. The city has done these things before, but not enough. And there's many things that I can think of right now. For example, retail. Retail is in a state of kind of devastation right now in New York City, and retail owners are suffering. What a brilliant opportunity right now to change the regulation of retail. And I'll just give a simple example. Retail in New York City is starting at the street level and continuing all the way to the depth of the property, usually 100 feet deep. But that value is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. And we know that restaurants and other places in the village, for example, where you enter the restaurant and there's a courtyard at the back, creates additional public engagement area that is great. What if the city finds a way to incentivize retail owners or owners of buildings that own the ground floor to reduce the amount of retail and expand the amount of public space? And that's something that could go over tax payments or other ways. So there are mechanisms by which good things can be done while incentivizing the private sector. And there are many things that the city can do on taxpayers' money to improve our city at large, but we need to be creative. And I feel that developers like Dan has been feeling that for a long time, where is this? The city is just creating more and more regulations with no incentivized system to do a better job and to create better products.
Are any of you involved in some conversations along those lines? Are there these proposals that are actually sort of in motion at all?
We're working.
Go ahead, Joanna.
So we're working with the city to actually update the active design guidelines, which are actually mandatory for all New York City funded projects. So they can reach through to public buildings, to infrastructure, and also to affordable housing, because the city actually has a small amount of money involved in that as well. So we're updating those right now, and they're actually going to be looking much more at mental health and social health as well, so social cohesion. So by changing the active design guidelines, because they're part of the city processes, they're part of the contracts, they're part of procurement, they're part of measurings of success. So you can use these existing mechanisms, I think, exactly what these guys were talking about. Like I used to run the Fresh program. It gave a massive floor area bonus, like the entire size of the supermarket. You were allowed to build that again on top of the building with an additional floor of the building, basically, for putting a grocery store into a neighborhood that was deemed a food desert at the time. And so like and that was a mechanism that had been developed for industrial properties. So they used the industrial property kind of mechanism and approval process and just changed the language slightly to expand definition of industrial to include grocery stores. So it was very clever, because you don't want to go through the 3-year process of having to create an entirely new system, right? You need to look at the systems that exist and expand the definition or add a definition, or those kind of things are much more efficient. So we've been talking to the folks we work with in New York City about active design and changing that. But that's a very small piece of the puzzle, right? That's not a financial incentive. That's more of a mechanism that affects public building and public spending.
Right.
Yeah, I'm in the midst of that exact gridlock with a few projects in New York right now that are master plan going through ULOC process. And the reason I call it a gridlock is we've been doing it for a while. Is that, as Dan mentioned, there's a political environment that is anti-development, period. And what the difficulty here is that you go to community boards and you try to talk about the elements that they should negotiate for to improve the community life. That it goes beyond just density and height. And unfortunately, this is an educational process that needs to be gone through, because a lot of those communities, for them, height and density is the source of all evil, when I think many of us understand that that's not the case. More open spaces, more active open spaces, better and more democratic retail, more affordable housing, all of these elements are the things that we should. So on one hand, you've got the communities. On the other hand, you've got city planning that might understand those elements but cannot enforce those ideas. And I think it's a very difficult one. I'm actually very interested in calling out right now through this platform for people to collaborate on those studies. And this is something that Joanna, I would want to talk to you separately, by which we can come up with plans, suggestions for city plannings of how things could be better and how a process of incentives could be accommodated to improve our neighborhoods. It's something that we all should be involved in.
Right. Joanna, can you share a few of your updating the manual for active design? What are some of the new elements that might be there?
Sure, absolutely. So mental health wasn't part of the original active design guidelines. So many of the different design strategies that affect mental health, and we've kind of touched on a couple actually already. So access to nature has a profound impact on mental health, and at all scales. So it could be a well-maintained park, it could also just be a small patio, or even interior plants, actually, just seeing them. So the nature piece is really important and much more prevalent in this set of guidelines. The other piece is maintenance, because you cannot create outdoor spaces, green spaces, really any spaces, and not maintain them. If you don't maintain space, it actually has a negative impact on trust, including trust in police. So we did a lot of original research around a publication called Assembly, and we looked at the correlation between seeing signs of deterioration in your public realm, so graffiti, poorly maintained sidewalks, all of those kind of things, including greenery. And they actually had a universally negative impact on people's perceptions of trust, their willingness to trust neighbors, as well as authority figures. So I think tying the understanding of design elements with maintenance, and that becomes tricky at a city level because you've got operational budgets and you have capital budgets, and never the two will go together. But just understanding those two things are very important. Understanding the role of programming to bring people together, understanding the co-benefits of that, right? It's not just nice to have. Those social bonds are actually what creates resilience, so that in times of emergency, you have strong social bonds, because we are heading for a very severe mental health crisis post-COVID-19. It's very predictable. After SARS, 16% of the population affected by SARS had PTSD, and 40% had increased levels of stress and anxiety. So our mental health was already going in the wrong direction. We already had very high levels of depression. It's actually the number one cause of disability in New York City. So that loss of productivity and work just associated with depression is massive already. So I think a lot of emphasis on mental health, things like lighting, all of these kind of things affect people's willingness to participate in public life, to be part of the community, and to trust one another. So there's going to be a lot of emphasis on that.
Right. I want to throw the last word to Dan and just ask, of some of the things that Joanna said, what do you think, what mechanisms would need to be there for that to become, a more realistic priority, or something that, you're able to include in your projects?
Well, again, I think, we're creatures of the market. So, land costs a certain amount, right? It costs whatever it costs, and your ultimate users will pay a certain amount. And in between, we have to be able to build a great building. So, that equation doesn't always add up. And that's why I think it's so important that, municipal policies, especially, tax policies, factor in here, and that the city uses that power to promote smart, sustainable, equitable development. And it can be done, but I think the private sector and the public sector and the not-for-profit sector, all have to come together and have a much better dialogue than we've been having. Right now, our dialogue, is really with the Amazon case. The mayor and the governor say, great, let's do it. And then all of a sudden, local politicians rise up and basically mutiny and say, we hate you and we hate development. And, that is really not a good formula for getting anything done. We need a much more constructive dialogue. It's got to be focused on the long term. The city has to be environmentally sustainable. It has to be, sustainable from an equity standpoint. I mean, I think we're watching right now the fruits of a very inequitable, society come back to haunt us. And so, affordable housing and better neighborhoods throughout the city, it all has to be part of the equation. But right now, the dialogue is not productive. And I think that, the dialogue has to be more productive. And I'm sure, Joanna works on that every day. But again, this, in this broader platform and from someone in my vantage point, we just need a lot more constructive dialogue with the public sector and ways to incentivize good development.
Right. Well, yes, and you kind of touched on it, of course. I mean, we have the COVID crisis, the health crisis going on, and now with the death of George Floyd and the various protests throughout the city, there is a lot going on and there's a lot of issues to address. So I appreciate both of you, all of you bringing it up, and I'm so glad that we had this conversation. We are going to close the call now, but to the viewers, thank you so much for joining us. On Wednesday, we're going to be back again, and Dan Doctoroff and Alicia Glenn are going to be our guests. So that's going to be a panel you won't want to miss. And thank you all for coming and being part of the conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.